Hello, what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to create a Java class called Invoice that a hardware store might use to represent an invoice for an item sold at the store. An invoice should include four pieces of information as instance variables. The first one is part number, data type string, and we're going to initialize it to none in our default constructor. There'll be a part description. It will be type string. We're going to initialize it again to none and the default constructor. The quantity of the item being purchased, which is a data type of int, and we're going to initialize it to 0 in the default constructor. And then price per item, which is a data type of double, and we're going to initialize it in the default constructor to 0.0. So in addition to the four instance variables, we're going to create our default constructor where we'll initialize our instance variables. We're going to provide an accessor or get and a mutator or set method for each instance variable. And in addition, we're going to provide a method named get invoice amount that calculates the invoice amount by multiplying the quantity by the price per item, then returns the amount as a double value. After that, then we're going to create a class called Invoice Test that will test the invoice class. In the main method of the invoice class, we're going to prompt the user for two invoices, and we're going to create two objects of the invoice class. After that, we're going to display each of the invoice instances, and we're going to output the invoice amount with 2 digits after the decimal point. So when we create that invoice test, we're going to prompt the user for the values for the four instance variables, the part number, part description, quantity, and price per item. So I've already gone ahead and created each class. So what we're going to do next is we're going to walk through each one of the classes. So the first thing you'll want to do when you create classes in Java is you want to include comments within your classes, and that's what I've done. So I've specified what the class is. It's an invoice class. I've used public class invoice to define my invoice class, and then what I've done is I've defined my four instance variables. And you want to make sure when you create those instance variables, you want to make sure and use the private keyword to go ahead and specify each one of your instance variables so that no user can go ahead and access those instance variables directly. The only way they can access them is through the public mutator and accessor methods. So I've gone ahead, I've created my four instance variables. Then on lines 9 through 16, what I've done is I've actually gone in and I've created my default constructor. Again, the name of the constructor must match the name of the class, which is invoice. There is no return type, and it is accessible by the public. So what I've done here is, like the instructions noted, I've set part number equal to none, part description equal to none, quantity equal to 0, and price per item equal to 0.0. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to define each one of the accessor methods for my four instance variables. And a good practice is to just go ahead and append get to the name of your instance variables. Usually, all accessor methods or most accessor methods are get methods. So that's what I've done when I've defined those. The first one is get part number. What that method is going to do is it will return my part number, and what I'm specifying is the return type in my method, which is a string. So when this method is called, it will return our part number for that specific invoice. Then the same thing for part description. Again, the return type is string, and what it will be returning is my value held in my instance variable part description of that specific instance of the invoice. Quantity will return the quantity. The data type of quantity is an int, so you must make sure and specify the correct return type. The return type must match how the instance variable data type that was defined up above when you defined your methods or your instance variables. And then finally, we have our getter for our price per item. The return type of that is double, and we're returning our price per item instance variable value for that instance of the invoice that was created. So those are my get or my assessor methods. Again, you cannot change the values of those instance variables using a get method. You just return the value, and those are all public. That way anybody can access and get the part number, get the part description, quantity, and price per item. And then next I've defined my 4 mutator methods. What a mutator method, like mutator, specifies is it changes the value of my instance variables. So what I'm doing here is there is no return type, so that's why it's public void, and what gets passed in is the value that you want to go ahead and set your part number to. And I'm using the this prefix to distinguish the 2 part numbers. So basically what this specifies is is that you want to update the instance's part number with the part number argument that gets passed in when the method is called. And then part descriptions, the same thing. A string gets passed in, and then I go ahead and I set my part description instance variable. An int gets passed in for my quantity. I set that instance variable quantity to the value that gets passed in. And then finally, price per item. I set it to the double that gets passed in, and I set my instance variable to the value that gets passed in. And then finally, we want to go ahead and get the invoice amount. And a lot of people may go in and actually create another instance variable that saves the invoice amount, but you do not have to do that. Since we have access to both the quantity and the price per item instance variables in your class, all we need to do is we need to just define a get method. And each time that get method gets called, what it'll do is it'll take the value stored in the quantity and the value stored in the price per item, and it'll calculate the total cost and return that value. So again, when you create your class, all you want to do within your class is you want to go ahead and provide the information for your instance variables. In some cases, you'll provide a constructor. If you do not provide a constructor, the default constructor will be used for the class when you create your class. And then you want to go ahead and provide the assessor and mutator methods. You do not want to do any of your testing within the class that you define. That is why we're defining a separate test class that contains a main method. So let me just go ahead and save this. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look at our invoice test class next. And I think what I will be doing is I will look at that invoice test class in the next video.